Hello, this is Basar. In this tutorial, we are going to introduce the authentication and authorization to our Express application. As usual, we have this repository, and in this tutorial, we are going to start our implementation from this branch Auth start, and the content of this tutorial can be found in the Auth final. Now let's go over the project first. Here we have the source, and we have this user router, and so far we have the endpoints for the CRUD operations like adding, updating, deleting and listing users, and we are not doing anything about the authentication or authorization when we are, for instance, updating this user. So anyone can send a request to this endpoint and update any user data. Also in the delete endpoint, we do the same thing. We are not checking who is sending that request and if that user is allowed to do that request. Now we are going to do that in this tutorial. Let's start the application first. And let's demonstrate the problem in the Postman. Here in the application we have this get endpoint for users, and this is returning all the users, and initially there are 5 users in this application, and we can get the users by their ID like this one. So we have this user 1, and we can send a request to update this user's username like this. So we send a request to this endpoint with this put method, and let's say the body will be something like this, user 1 updated. And here we are receiving 200 OK. And if we get the user from backend, here we can see the username is updated. Now we are going to add authentication and authorization logic to this request, so we won't be allowing anyone to update this one. So we will be checking the authentication of the incoming request. So when we are sending a request to this endpoint, we are going to send the request with authorization. And we are going to use the basic authentication for this implementation. And this basic authentication is basically looking for 2 values, the username and password. In the user object, let's open that one. In the user object, we have this username, email, and password. But just because this Postman is saying it is looking for username, we don't have to use that username of our model. We can go with the email value too. So let's do that. So for user 1, the email address is like this, user1@mail.com, and the password is p4sword. So these values can be checked right here. When the application is initialized, we are creating users from user 1 to 5, and each of the user and the user email is generated based on the iterated number. And the default password is this one. So we are going to send our request like this, and this request is basically having this header, this authorization header. And the authorization header has this value basic space, this base 64 encoded value. And we can decode it like this, just copying this one. And we are going to decode this value. So here pasting the encoded value. And if we decode it right here, here it is showing this is basically this user name part, which is the email of that user, and there is column and the password. So when we are sending this request to backend, we are going to check the authorization header, and we will just decode that value, split the parts, and query the database based on these values. So let's do our implementation. So when we are receiving a request to this endpoint, we are going to do this check first. From this request, we will get, let's say, the authorization header. And the authorization header is basically coming from this request headers authorization. And if we don't have authorization header, we can just return an error response immediately. Status will be 403, forbidden. And let's send the message. And let's say this is a message forbidden. And if we have the authorization header, this authorization header is having this string, just copying this one and pasting right here. So this is the value in the authorization header. And what we can do is we can take the substring part. So we can just skip the first 6 characters and take the rest of it like this. And let's assign it to a variable like this. Let's call this one encoded. And this part is the base 64 encoded value. Now we can decode this value by the buffer of Node, and we can decode it from this encoded value, and this is base 64 encoded. And in the end we are going to take the string output of this operation, and we are expecting it to receive in ASCII encoding. Then let's assign this one to a variable too. This is decoded, and the end result is the one we have seen right here, this one. Now we can split this value, decoded, split, and we can split based on this column. Then this is going to be ending up with an array like this. There is this user one at mail.com and password. So this string is splitted based on this column, and it is ending up this result. Now we can take the values from this array like this. Just like the object destructuring, we can use the array destructuring like this in square brackets. The first item in this array is the email, and the second one is the password. So that's how we can take the values from the authorization header. Now we need to check the database to see if there is this user with this email. In the user service, we have this function find by email, and we can call that one. So let's get the let's call this one as authenticated user, and let's get it by user service find by email, and we will pass the email to it. By the way, this function is async, so let's await here. Now, if there is no user, so if this is returning false, then let's return this error response back. So if there is no header, we are returning forbidden. If there is no user, so the header is there, but there is no such user in our application, then again we are going to return this forbidden. Let's save these changes and try this one. So in Postman, let's send a request. Currently we are filling this form with this user, but let's go with the no auth first. Now we are seeing this forbidden message, and if we send a request with, let's send the request with empty values, or we can type a non-existing user email to here, and this is also returning this forbidden. So our controls right here are working. So if there is no authorization header, it is failing, and if there is no user, it is failing. Now we need to do one more control here. we need to make sure the request is coming with correct password. So we are not doing any check here. So what we will do is, if you have watched the previous tutorials, when we are creating user, when we are saving this user to database, we are encrypting that user's password with this bcrypt algorithm. So to make sure this request, this authenticated request, is having the correct password, we are going to use this bcrypt once again. So just importing that one here in this user router, and let's check the password, and we do that by bcrypt's compare function. So we are going to compare the password we are getting in the authorization header against the hashed value which is coming from the database, this authenticated user. So this is the hashed value, and this is the clean text coming from the client. And this is comparing the result and either returning true or false based on the match. So let's assign this to a variable match. And again, this is an async operation, so await here. So if this is not matching, again, let's return forbidden. So again, opening the Postman, now filling the form with user1 at mail.com and sending a request with correct password. So this is going to be successful. Here it is saying updated 200, okay. But if I change the password to something like this is not the correct password. Here we are receiving forbidden. But this implementation is not enough yet, because this user's ID is 1, but let's fix this part. The password is correct now, and if I send a request, it is returning 200, okay. But if I send a request to another user ID, it is also returning 200, okay too. So let's check it right here in user list. Here we can see user 1 is updated, but also user 2, which is having this ID 2, is also updated with this value. So we should not be allowing this operation. Let's say the user will only be allowed to update their own data. And we can do it like this. So until this part, we have the user. The user is coming with the valid password. Then what we can do is we can just compare this authenticated users, the user we are getting from the database, and check that user's ID with the ID we have in this path. So if authenticated user ID does not equal to the ID in the path, then again let's send this error. Saving it and opening Postman. Now we are sending our request with user1 credentials and sending it for the user2 ID, and here it is returning forbidden now. So other than its own ID, the other requests are being rejected. Now we need to do same implementation also for this delete endpoint. So only that logged in user can delete its data. So users won't be able to delete other users. And instead of repeating this implementation in the delete handler, we can extract this part as a middleware. So in this shared, again, let's create a middleware. Let's call this one as basic authentication. And just cutting this part, just leaving this this user ID compare part in this route handler, and cutting the parts before that and paste to here. But first let's module exports. This is going to be a middleware function. It's going to be taking request, response, and next. And in this one, we are going to check the header. Now let's not return any fail response in this middleware. Instead of that, let's update the request. Let's provide the authenticated user to the request and allow this handler to control that one and act accordingly. So we are going to check if there is authorization. So just removing this part. If there is authorization header, then we are going to decode the value, query the user table. So we need to have the user service right here, and it is coming from user folder, user service. And also this is using await, so let's mark our function as async. Then we are going to do this control like this. If there is authenticated user, then we are going to do this check. We compare the password, so we will also need to get the bcrypt from the dependency bcrypt. And if match, so there is header, there is user, and that user password is matching to the incoming password. So we find the user. Then let's update this request object. Let's say request will have authenticated user, and this is the user we queried from database. So if there is user, we are querying it from database and adding to the request object and calling next. Now in the user router, we can use this middleware function. So just importing that one, basic authentication, and we get it from shared basic authentication. And we are going to use that one right here, just like this ID number control. We can add multiple middleware functions, basic authentication. Now we can get the authenticated user directly from this request. And all we would do here is, if there is no authenticated user, then return this error. If there is user, then all we do is just compare that user's ID with the ID we are receiving in the path. So saving this one. I have a typo here. This is going to be basic authentication. Saving this one. So in Postman, this is user 1 sending request to user 3. Again, it is returning forbidden. And if I go to user 1, it is returning success. But if I try with the incorrect password, it is failing. Or if I go with a non-existing user, it is failing. And similarly, if you would want to use this logic in the delete functionality, all we need to do is just add this basic authentication to this delete handler and do the same controls like this, just copying this part and pasting here, checking the authenticated user and checking if that authenticated user's ID is equal to the ID in the path. Saving it again and opening Postman. Let's send delete request for this user 1 with invalid credentials. It is failing. The username is correct, but the password is wrong. It is failing again. and the credentials are correct, but let's go to user 2. It is failing, but if we go to user 1, here it is saying it is removed, and if we check the users, here we don't see the user 1 in this list anymore. So that's all for this tutorial. That's how we can introduce the basic authentication to the Node.js application. Thanks for watching and hope to see you in the next tutorials.